Well, before you watch this video, you should watch that video about DNA coiling and being replicated in the cell, um, because I'm going to talk about that. And it's relevant because when we try to figure out whether the membrane or the DNA came first, um, we may actually be able to answer this question by looking at the DNA right now as it behaves today. Um, we like, some of us, or some evolutionary biologists like to talk about DNA as though it replicates itself, that it's the real causal force or information acting in evolution, and everything else is sort of an ephemeral, uh, you know, meaningless show that doesn't actually have any causal influence or effective role to play in the ongoing course of evolution. Um, but really, when you look at the genes themselves, they require proteins to do everything that they do, whether it's coil up to fit into the nucleus of a cell or reproduce themselves. In both cases, they are helpless without proteins, without these other molecules to sort of, chaperone them along, to be their dancing partner, so to speak. Um, so this, to me, suggests, and to a lot of scientists and molecular biologists, that the membrane enclosed cell and the intercellular matrix um, of chemicals that are very reactive um, is the essential uh, aspect of life. It's what came first. This shifts the causal explanation of what life is, because no longer are we talking about a static crystalline molecule, which we basically understand in terms of information as though it were disembodied transcendental information. When we look at life instead as if the membrane came first, we see that it's it's just molecules themselves forming a boundary between themselves and something else, and through the boundary enabling a form of communication between itself and its environment. And this is just, it's an expression of an increase in complexity. Still all physical stuff going on, but it's physical stuff that takes on new habits, and in habituating itself gains new abilities. All of a sudden life emerges, and now physical matter can do this new thing with energy that just so happens to be aware of its own doing. It's what happens, it's a perfectly natural thing. It just so happens that it can reproduce itself very efficiently because it has evolved this DNA. But see, I'm kind of reversing the way we describe biology now and evolution by saying, no, it's not the DNA that causes cells to do what they do and organisms to do what they do. It's the membranes. It's the cellular process itself. And I don't really want to do that. I'm not just trying to reverse it. The fact is that each of these are points of view to say that the cell is in control of the DNA and is replicating the DNA, that the cell is responsible for interpreting all the information that is supposedly contained in the DNA. This is just as much a false reification as saying that it's the opposite, that it's the DNA that contains all the information that makes the cell. We need to hold both of these in mind at once and understand that it's really neither. It's really what's going on here and now. So let's not get into that. Um, the reason it's significant that the membrane came first is that it just reorients our whole understanding of life, and we see it as a necessary consequence of physical energy on a planet this distance from the sun and so forth, rather than a fluke. That, if it's all just pure chance, at least before DNA comes along to structure the history of chance such that it can remember what it's already tried, for that physical chance process to produce the DNA molecule would require an almost infinite span of time, because it's just so improbable that this just came together in an ocean of molecules freely floating randomly around. But when we understand that life, meaning, purpose, all of these deeper aspects of reality that you can't understand reductionistically, they're a product of boundaries being erected. Human society is a product of the boundary of the first cities, the walls that were erected. Just like the first life is a product of a boundary, a cell membrane, a semi-permeable membrane that can interpret what it wants to put into itself, what it wants to put out, what it wants to keep in. This is what makes meaning. We can understand, from the genocentric view, the reductionistic view, we can think we understand at least that evolution is just the reproduction and slight variation and inheritance of DNA. But we have to ignore a lot to say that that explains anything. We have to ignore, the very quality of life itself. DNA doesn't feel anything. Information doesn't feel anything. We do, and I know you agree with that. But I'm saying, not only do we feel, not only do organisms feel, they act. And their action does play a role in the way evolution unfolds. They act consciously. Humans act consciously in a very sophisticated way that allows us to do all kinds of, neat tricks. It might not necessarily mean that they're more adaptable tricks. We may soon drive ourselves into extinction along with, a couple other million species in our wake, but it doesn't mean that we are somehow the pinnacle of this process. It doesn't mean that our type of consciousness is the best. It certainly is complex, but sometimes complexity just gets in the way. So I don't think we can separate ourselves from nature. And so our feelings are the feelings of the whole of it. Because, really, we're discussing, we're not discussing biology, we're not, discussing anything scientific, we're discussing these archetypes. You're defending ideas, and I'm defending the body. And you really can't have one without the other. In fact, I think both are meaningless as soon as we separate one from the other. Unless they can relate, neither of them has anything to do with our actual lives, with our actual experience. If we separate ideas from the body, or genes from our organism, from our, somatic embodiment, then both cease to have a meaning anymore. So let's erect